Malizalisi dinga lakho, Thixo Nkosi yenyaniso. Bring up your mercy, oh God, Lord of truth, and so on and so on. Yeah. Was it just coincidence that violence always followed me wherever I went? Was I like Shakespeare's spirits, doomed for a certain term to walk the night? By township standards, I was mild-mannered. But no matter how I chose to look at it, no matter how many times I told myself that I was a boy from the mean streets of Durban trying to eke out a living in a mean world, I could not help noticing that I was fast descending into another kind of hell. The skeletons that I thought were safely locked away in the catacombs of history were now rattling in my mind. I sat down to write my story.
Well, today I have the enormous privilege of having Vusisizwe Khumalo with me to have a fireside chat to talk about his life and his incredible writing and what he really cares about. It'll take too much time to enumerate his extraordinary CV and accomplishments. You can get that on his blog and his webpage and on Facebook, because I want to spend this time to try and pack in as much as I can about Fred and his writing. Well, Fred is a busy man, and this evening I saw on his Facebook post today he's off to the Abantu Book Festival in Soweto to talk about his latest book, The Longest March. So I'm lucky to get a march on that event by getting to talk about that book to me first. It's his latest work in historical fiction and commemorates the march of some 7,000 Zulu mine workers from Johannesburg in 1899 when war broke out between the Boers and the Brits, and they walked all the way to Hattingspruit in KZN to get out of being in the crossfire of that war. So that's The Longest March, and it came hard on the heels of his book Dancing the Death Drill, which is a powerful story of love, war and friendship inspired by the tragic sinking of the SS Mendi, which was a troop ship which was filled with mostly African native labour contingent, which was rammed in a dark night in the mist off the Isle of Wight and sank, taking some 600 people to their grave. Two excellent works of historical fiction which I've added to my library. Fred and I had to postpone this interview because I'm rather glad we did, because that gave me a chance to read a third of his books. His autobiography, Touch My Blood, published in 2005. And that is definitely not a work of historical fiction. It is one of the most self-effacing, honest, and transformational biographies that I have ever read. It's a riveting tale of resilience and fortitude of a young man growing up under the heavy, violent, dehumanizing system of apartheid. The excerpt that Fred was reading was from the prologue of that book, and it gives a very helpful key to understanding his vocation as a writer. Fred, I am in even greater awe after reading your autobiography. And you explain that your Zulu name, Vusisizwe, means the one who's going to revive the nation. And your baptismal name, baptized as a young little Catholic baby, was Frederick, which means the ruler of peace. Now, I can well imagine a praise singer would actually precede you. Nkosi yukolo, Vusisizwe.
Yeah.
The Prince of the Peace who is going to revive the nation. 15 years now down the road from when you wrote that book in 2005. Are you reconciled to that vocation?
Well, it was a massive cross that my parents put upon my shoulders. I don't think I'm up to the task, but in my own small individual way, I've been trying to, through the talent that God bestowed upon me, use the talent to tell my story, which in turn contextualizes the struggles, the trials and tribulations of my family in particular, and my community and my people in general. So that's the challenge I've taken upon myself through my writings, whether it be it in the Sunday Times, in my column in the Sunday Times, or the books that I've started publishing now.
Yeah.
They're very intensely personal.
Yeah, so it was an extraordinarily personal account, and almost like a confession, because in that prologue you talk about needing to get reconciled to your demons. So Desmond Tutu always said, unless we confront the ghosts of our past, they're going to return to haunt us in the future.
Exactly. Sure.
And as I've got to know you, just latterly when you're news editor for the Sunday Times, I always sensed you, and reading on Facebook, you're a very joyful, relaxed, and humorous guy. I didn't realize how much you've had to go through to get where you are, and your extraordinary determination to basically stay true to your calling.
Yeah, my youngest brother was one of those lost guys. Because by the time he reached his pubescent age, my father was a bit too old to impose discipline upon him. So it fell upon me to put my younger brother on the straight and narrow. But he rebelled. We fought. We fought, and he got involved in things that I would never have ever imagined. Car hijacking. Can you believe that? From that family, breaking and entering and all that. All under the guise of being a comrade who was fighting against the system and so on. So his criminal activities would have to be tolerated because he was fighting against the system, you know. And so he was not alone. The whole milieu that he grew up under kind of condoned that kind of behavior. It became a norm. We took him to university first year and he dropped out, went to prison, and from there it was downhill. So he never finished university. And by that time I was also grappling with my own stuff. I went to Canada. By the time I came back, he was totally lost by then. The war was raging in the townships and so on. So he became lost, he became a dropout, a proper criminal.
But you managed to survive that despite the fact that it would seem to have been the strategy of the state at the time was to basically take off the leaders, the people with conscience, and leave it up to the komtsotsis. And that's when you started seeing the brutality. Yeah,
the brutality was there. And it was really tough growing up there. And I was lucky that I had a very supportive but very strict family. We went to church, I was baptized, but also our passion was football. My father owned a football club. That was our passion, so we had to divide our time accordingly and very religiously. So much so that if there was a match, a football match on Sunday, we had to attend early morning mass at 7 o'clock so we could be free by 10 o'clock to go to the football stadium to help my father with the soccer kit and so on and so on. And we also, at a later stage, joined the soccer team as boys, the 3 boys. I'm the eldest. So we played, so that kept us highly focused. But of course, growing up in the township, there are so many distractions. You interact with bad elements and all that. And of course, you get politicized from a very early age if you were black and South African. That is inevitable.
But you seem to, in your book, Touch My Blood, when you talk of that, it's about your identity, and you talk about your grandfather and your forebears and your ancestors. So how much did your ancestral connection play a role in giving you the fortitude that you have?
Let's go back a bit. Because my grandfather was absent from the farm where they were tenant laborers. It fell upon my father as the eldest male child to abandon school and then fill in the gap that had been left by my grandfather. Because my grandfather had absconded, had gone to the mines. So my father left school when he was 10, grade 2. So he had to abandon school and start working as a man of the house in my grandfather's absence. So when he told these stories, very casually, he would every now and then, not that he was giving us an education or giving us a lecture, he would just say, you know, you guys are having it so easy. At your age, I would have to wake up at 5 o'clock, go and check the cattle and the cows that are milked, and then take them, some of them to pasture, and he would just give us a day-to-day in his life to say to us, work hard at school so that you don't become like me. But in the telling of those stories, a seed was being planted in my head that really I didn't want to leave school, to abandon school, because I wanted to be better than my parents. But at another level, there was this anger at the whole injustice of it. The fact that such a bright young man, because my father was really bright, even without the education, he was very, very, very smart. And he was acknowledged by our neighbors as one of the bright men in our neighborhood. And I would imagine, had he been given an opportunity to go to school and university, he would have been a leader of some sort. So all these things, these stories that were being told, inculcated in me this determination to try and work harder at whatever I do. Yeah, and that kind of discipline has always stayed with me.
The parallels between my own experience of working with Yamampondo and finding also people that were deeply connected to their land and to their place, their sense of identity. In my social work and counselling people, you know, there's very much a pattern which I find, that we move from a state of order where things are familiar. And if you think of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, you know, about this moving from this familiar, mundane place, but life seems to be that you always go through immense disorder, and then you get back, you go through your dark cave, you find your elixir, you find a mentor, you get new insights, and you return to the familiar place. It's still the same, but you're not. You have now come to a deeper realization. The observation I'm making is that it seems that because you had solid roots, you were able to then go through that extraordinary stage of the apartheid disorder and violence and all the rest, because there was some sense in which you knew where your roots were.
I suppose, yes. Knowing where I came from became an anchor whenever I got lost, because as a young man I did get lost every now and then. You experiment with substances, benzene, glue sniffing and all that, but you always remember, no, this my father wouldn't approve of. And sometimes they would find out and I would get a lesson. Sometimes they wouldn't find out that I'd been naughty, that I'd been bunking school and all that. And of course the church upbringing also came into the fore, because there was always this thing called a conscience. Even when I was with these friends from the neighborhood who came from families that really didn't care whether they went to school or not. And there was always this thing that stayed with me to say, no, but you're not like them. This is wrong, you know. It might be cool while you are with these friends of yours, but when you're sitting, as my mother would say, when you're sitting on the toilet by yourself, then you remember who you are.
Because I also was brought up a Catholic and as an altar boy, and you talk about singing in the choir and all that. That's been my experience too. But the really sad thing is, as a social worker, and I still haven't really come to terms with how to deal with it, is that because of the extraordinary disruption of the social cohesion of traditional African society, that so many young men are born into disorder. They don't even know order. And for me, the Yamampondo, I found people there that did have that connection. And that's why they've been able to tell Gwede Mantashe, sorry, you're not minding our land. You know, footsack. With all these interviews I do with people, if the opportunity presents itself, I reflect on a quote which is on the beginning of my book, which is from Ben Okri. And I want to just recite it to you and ask you to what extent it resonates with your own mission in life. Ben Okri writes, stories are the secret reservoir of values. If you change the stories people and nations tell themselves, you change the people and the nation. If they tell themselves stories that are lies, they will have to bear the consequences of those lies.
Yes.
If they tell themselves stories that face their own truths, they will free their histories for future flowerings. He talks about individuals and nations. Where do you see South Africa going? Are you reviving the nation?
Through the written word, through the stories we tell, by disputing the lies of the past and challenging the lies of the past, and instead, uprooting those long established trees from the past, and instead replacing them with new seeds of hopefully truth. And then the fruit that is going to be realized from those trees is what is going to feed our future generations. And our future generations are in dire need for that nourishment of truth. So yes, Okri's words resonate very, very eloquently with me.
It's not talking about your books. Am I right in saying that you have tried to bring history alive? And what I like is that you practice what you write about. You walked that same journey.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that experience and explain to people why they need to now go and follow in your footsteps. If not walking, at least in a figurative sense, to go into that journey into the past.
Yeah, a little bit about the book that informs the journey, and so on, how they feed into each other. So the book is called The Longest March. It's a historical novel inspired by and based on something that really happened in 1899. Just before the outbreak of the Anglo-Boer War, thousands of black mine workers found themselves stuck here in Johannesburg, because the trains that would have taken them home had been either taken by the army, mainly taken by the army.
Commandeered for
military purposes. So now these people are stuck in Johannesburg, but they are very eager to go home because they realize that even though initially they were skeptical about this impending war, they could now see that it was really imminent, it was about to happen. And they were desperate to go home. And so they thought, let's walk home. But there was this fear that if they walked as this huge body, because they'd organized themselves into this huge body, they realized that they might be mistaken for an army by anxious farmers on the way. So they approached a white guy who had been instrumental in recruiting many of them to come to the mines in the first place. He worked for the Native Affairs Department, and his name was John Mawick. They said, notify government to secure safe passage for us, which he did. He wrote a series of letters which were sent to the different magistrates in all the towns that they would be passing through to say, when you see this huge body of black people, do not shoot. We come in peace. What you can instead do for us, ask your farming community to slaughter sheep so that they can sell meat to the natives that would be passing through, which is what happened. So these guys walked from the 7th of October 1899, covering a distance of 420 kilometers from Johannesburg to Natal in 10 days. And then, of course, they got there safely, and then they split into the smaller group. Others were going to Natal, others proceeding to Zululand, and so on. So I wrote this novel, dramatizing that particular story, and the book came out in September.
Now, I want to talk about the fictional aspect. Before we go to that, let me just talk about the non-fictional aspect. Because firstly, that white man that facilitated, I'm almost certain my great-grandfather would have known him. He could have almost been my great-grandfather, because, and this is what I found so extraordinary, because I've been trying to understand my historical ancestral roots, and my great-grandparents were traders at Sitsa Falls, so my great-grandfather could speak the language very well. When gold was discovered, in 1886. Everybody got so excited. He then moved with his family to Johannesburg as one of the first 3,000 residents of Johannesburg, with the ambitions and the hopes that he had bought a claim and was going to become fabulously wealthy. Sadly, he never did. J.B. Robinson swindled him out of his claim together with others, and he went back to Ponderland during the war with his family for refuge. And I always love the irony that white people went as refugees to the Eastern Cape.
Yes.
I hope Helen Zille sees that story. Because everybody talks about it. But I want you to read from your book that passage in which you describe Johannesburg in 1899.
Yes. Johannesburg is plunging into an abyss so prematurely. Born just less than 20 years earlier, Johannesburg is still not a place for children. It is still too young to have a family-raising culture, too nervous, too unsure of itself to be a nurturer. Johannesburg, a reluctant mother with all these children, like a litter of pigs, pulling and biting and clawing at her already overused, sagging breasts. Breasts whose nipples are clogged with dust and blood. Johannesburg, this ugly pimple on the otherwise unremarkable face of Lady Transvaal. Johannesburg, a pimple that overnight has festered into a sore whose putrescence won't stop attracting parasites and pests from all over the world. Fortune seekers from Australia and Britain, Jewish traders and speculators from Eastern Europe, smooth-talking killers and pimps from the United States of America, prostitutes from the Malay slums of the Cape, Zulu tribesmen from the Natal coast, warriors from Wonderland, wide-eyed kitchen boys from Nyasaland, blanket-clad, slow-moving folk from Basutoland, a melting pot of cultures and civilizations, nay, a cesspool of clashing civilizations, churning and churning. Even as the city hurtles towards the inevitable war, Philippa knows that on the other side of the bloodbath, Johannesburg will never be the same again.
When I read that book, I posted on Facebook that suddenly I understood why my grandmother, she was born in 1889, so she would have been 10 years old.
When the war broke out.
Yeah. I knew her well. My grandmother was this wonderfully creative woman. She would never talk about living in Johannesburg. She created this lovely fiction for us as children growing up, you know, with our fantasy world, that she was born in Spain, that she was a kind of...
Yeah, the truth was too unpalatable and traumatizing.
And a sense of also shame that her father, when he came back from Ponderland, he couldn't get a job. Fortunately, he found a job and died as a night watchman in 1915 in Johannesburg, Auckland. So it suddenly gave me an insight that maybe I need to write an historical novel myself about it. But for me, I'm still
it's a powerful story. It's a powerful story.
And the other point of connection and inflection between my story and yours is that Hattingspruit is the place I grew up and had the happiest time of my life as a young boy.
Okay.
I was born and brought up in Dundee. And me and my friends would go yachting on the dam at Hattingspruit. So when I read your book, it put Hattingspruit on the map. But it was always on my map. But suddenly it became interesting, and I never knew that about Hattingspruit. I didn't have that consciousness. So that's the historical side. But the fictional aspect, you weave an incredible love story into that.
Thank you.
Which
Thank you.
I find a little bit hard to believe actually happened. But tell us, how did you come to formulating that love story and that love triangle?
I looked at three major themes or three major realities of the time. One of them being homosexuality on the minds. That is a fact. It has been covered by true historians. I'm not a historian. For example, Charles van Onselen covers it at some length, homosexuality on the minds, in his book New Babylon, New Nineveh. But of course, these guys who would sleep with boys on the minds didn't think of themselves as homosexuals. That is the contradiction that we still live with today. If you go to prison, there are men who sleep with other men, but they don't regard themselves as homosexuals, because it's
looking for intimacy, looking for that.
So I wanted to bring that up as a reality that was prevalent on the minds, and I thought let me use that as something to put my hat on, as so to speak, as one of the themes that I should highlight. Because there is this thing in the black community that we are so much in denial about homosexuality in our ranks. We say it's a white thing, it came with white people. No, it's always been there, it's just that people never spoke about it. So I wanted us to speak about it here and now. So I bring it from the annals of history. And then I look at the issue of race and identity. There were black people who were married to white women. Not many, but because there was no law. Even though it was socially frowned upon, there was no law that said you couldn't get married across the racial divide. And it happened especially in the Eastern Cape. Theo Soga's son was married to a Scottish woman, and he was a highly educated man. He went to study in Britain and came back. And it happened in Natal as well, mostly among educated black communities, people who had converted to Christianity and so on. So I wanted to look at how it would play out in Johannesburg itself. Yes, because my protagonist is a relatively educated black man who hasn't pursued any profession, so to speak, but he finds himself working on the mines, being a clerk at some stage. And he falls in love with this woman who gets mistaken for a white woman. Actually, she's not white. She is a colored person who could pass for white because she was so light and so on and so on. Again, another phenomenon that has been written about by academics, colored people who pass for white and black people who pass for colored. Because it was always, if you pass for the next stage in the rang or hierarchy, you were trying to access privileges. So this woman would every now and then pass for white to access privileges.
So you deal with the racial issue and the stigmatization about homosexuality. And it occurred to me as I was reading it, is that, we can report sort of homophobic sort of statements to the Human Rights Commission. John Kwelani can be called before them. But how do you really change that? Well, you need to tell that sort of story. And I want the lady say, offer a copy of your book to John Kwelani. Let me then interview him after he's read it. Because, in a sense, we could say he was just brave enough to articulate what I'm sure was unspoken in so many circles.
It's only through dialogue that people come to terms with their denialism. When you speak to people about this, they realize how homophobic and closed-minded they are. And then you say to them, it actually happened. And they say, really? And then you have a discussion, a dialogue. Obviously, gradually, you are beginning to penetrate those dark catacombs in their heads that exist. To say, you know what? These things were realities in the past, and they did happen, they still do happen. And what is wrong with being homosexual in the first place,
Spoiler alert. It ends with the most beautiful, touching thing about this mistaken for white woman who discovers that the man who's now father of a child, they've been on this long walk together, has had this homosexual relationship, and she finds it within herself to embrace that.
Yes.
You're in the book there, you don't carry on. I was like left hanging on the thread. Are you going to do a sequel to kind of help us tease out Philippa's story and what that child...
Most definitely. I think that should be obvious. When you've read this book, you come to the end of the book, and you say, really? No, she wouldn't just accept it like that. And so the sequel, which I'm working on at the moment, then looks at how they raise their child in the transit home of theirs, transit camp in Pietermaritzburg. and how over time she grapples with her husband's infidelity in the first place, and the fact that he was having an affair with another man. That was a shock, and
that man was highly jealous of the fact that he was now abandoned him for.
Yeah, and how do you deal with that over time as a woman who is pregnant with this child? And then there was this superstition on her part. How is this child going to turn out? Is it going to be a homosexual as well? You know, there are all these concerns and fears and psychological challenges, which I explore in the next book here. Yeah.
You like to walk your talk, so you've walked all the way to Hattingspruit. But have you perhaps considered doing a deep dive to the Mendi and going in to find and go back into that sort of dark
I'm not a scuba diver. I don't have the skills. And all. It would be interesting though. It would be interesting.
I'm teasing you because what's so interesting is that partly the reason why I was so determined to interview you. One of my sources in my book is Professor Tim Stapleton, who is a historian of Ponderland and various other Eastern Cape. And he referred a youngster to me who wanted to know more about the Amampondo. Because this youngster was a Navy diver who had dived down to the Mendi and actually put a plaque on that.
What's his name?
Claudio Chista. And I had a meeting with him and his girlfriend. He started telling about his own family history and narrative. From an Afrikaans background, became a Navy SEAL diver and was instrumental in planting this plaque and is fascinated with military history. So he was asking me, I'm the wrong person to tell you about military history because my whole narrative is how to get out of it. And he has dived and he's going to be in touch with you because he's so excited.
Lovely.
Now, isn't it marvelous to think that these connections enable us to uncover from the truth of the past? You know, Claudio, at least you now hear the story. You're going to read Fred's book.
I met a guy, he's a Zombondo guy, One of his ancestors was on the Mendi. And of course, one of the Mbondo kings was on the Mendi. Yes. And so he teamed up with a playwright from those parts. They wrote a play on the singing of the Mendi, which was staged some years ago, before I even wrote this book. And then he got money to go to the remains of the Mendi, because in Bondo or in Nguni culture, you have to go to where your ancestor would have died to collect their spirit and repatriate it. So that's what they did. They went to the Isle of Wight, and there was a diver, but he personally didn't go down, but he gave instructions to this diver to do some ritual underwater and bring whatever he could bring from underwater, which then they would take back home as an embodiment of the spirit of the ancestors. In Zulu culture, when let's say when you get killed here, your spirit is here. So at some stage we would have to go and
a ritual.
The branch of a tree, we call it umlahlangos. I don't know in English. So you go to the spot where the person died. You do the praise names of that person. You tell this person, we are here to fetch, John, we are here to fetch your spirit. We know your spirit has been wandering. You need peace. Now we are taking you home. And then you walk or you take whatever transportation is at your disposal. In your journey, you're not supposed to utter a single word until you reach home. And then when you get home, you do a ritual. Okay, John, you are home now. Welcome home. And then, of course, sometimes you slaughter a goat and so on. That is the ritual that is applicable across many Southern African ethnic groups.
It is, and I mean in the Ponderland, the Amadiba, same thing. I mean, on issues like when, you know, the routing of a road that Sanral's going to be building, I've had, you know, some of my friends who say to me, John, help us to explain to Sanral that they are violating a deep ancestral custom. Because we know they're going to just dismiss us as being this superstitious nonsense. And they would tell me, the ancestors appeared to the family and said, please don't have that road splitting this homestead in that particular way, because there's a disturbance that's going to happen. They assume that Sanral listens to me. They don't. Right now, Sanral are in big trouble because they haven't even got a resettlement action plan to deal with these things. They're just going to bulldoze it. But I want to tell you another funny connection.
We're extremely honored to be also presented with a gift, the bell of the SS Mendi. Please accept our gratitude.
I was honoured today to hand over to you and to the people of South Africa the ship's bell from the SS Mendi.
It was so amusing because one of my friends, John Curtis, is a cartoonist with Dr. Jack. And I don't know if you remember seeing that cartoon. Let me show it to you. This scene rings a bell.
Rings a bell, yeah.
And of course, the bell that it was ringing was that classic scene when Jan van Riebeck arrived in the Cape, which of course commenced the whole colonial agenda. But the funny thing is that John Curtis and Jack collaborate, and John does the conceptual stuff. And he was telling me that he sketched out the rough concept and he gave it to Jack, who lives in White River. But Jack didn't see the bell and left it out of the cartoon. John had put it there in front of Theresa May. And that then, of course, made sense about the wordplay. This scene rings a bell. And John said, okay, it's still funny, people will laugh, they don't know it. But then he was talking to another friend of his, Peter Vale, who said, I just love that picture.
I know Peter,
He says, because that wordplay, this rings a bell, was fantastic. But John said, but the bell wasn't in it. He says, no. That artwork was actually painted by Charles Davidson Bell.
Okay.
It did make sense. But I just find it extraordinary, all these synchronicities that happen. And how do you handle that sense of what we started out with the sense that you're called to be somehow participating in the healing of the nation? What can we expect from you more of in the future?
I'm a student of history. I'm not a historian.
Yes.
I just love history because every now and then you realize, you see history repeating itself. You see people failing to learn from history. And of course you see some hidden pockets of history. In this case, the story of the Mendi. It's one of those stories that in the black community it was told orally from generation to generation, but it didn't exist in writing. It never was in our history books. I'm among the first to actually put it on paper. Yes, of course, there was a book before mine by Norman Clothier, which was based on newspaper reports, how the newspapers covered the sinking of the SS Mendi, full stop. And then I was thinking to myself, yes, okay, it happened, we've read this book, but who were these human beings? So in writing Dancing the Death Thrill, I was trying to put flesh into the bones of history. And the reception that this book got gave me the impetus to look for other stories. Hence the story of The Longest March and the follow-up to The Longest March. And there are two other stories which I can't speak about now, which are themselves very crucial to the making of this country, but they've always been hidden. And when you read them, you realize how things have become the way they were because of what happened back then. And I've realized the power of historical fiction in making history more accessible. Because when you read history at school, it can be intimidating, but it's also impersonal. It's about all these huge generals it's all about these dates. This is when the war happened and all that. But the little guy gets overlooked or gets trampled upon, so to speak. So the little guy's story is forgotten. So I'm trying to tell the story from the little guy's point of view, which also then humanizes the whole narrative. And so I'll be producing these stories because I think in that way I'm making a contribution.
One of the distinctives of African culture as advantage over Western culture is that oral tradition and song. I mean, the classic thing about the Mendi is how they sang.
Yeah.
And that singing. Are you going to try and sing that phrase from the book? Because you can read it, but it's not the same as hearing it.
Yeah.
Can I propose on you to sing that? I'll tell you why afterwards. Because there's an extraordinary synchronicity that happened.
Okay, as one of the songs that they sang was actually a Christian hymn, which some of them would have been exposed to. Incidentally, it is one of the songs that was also done at the launch of the ANC in 1912 in Bloemfontein, Mangaon. Bring up your mercy, or truthful God, and so on. So they sang that, and then there were work songs, of course. Abelu Goswa, and they would do that as well, digging those trenches and so on, or carrying logs and so on.
And it kept their spirits up and their morale.
Those work songs have always been part of how black people do manual work. First of all, it keeps them focused, and it creates this sense of harmony. So that when shovels fall into the ground, attacking the ground, they do that in a synchronized way. When that is driven by a slogan or a song, so the synchronicity is there. It adds impetus and vigor to how they are doing the work.
And underground mine workers working.
Exactly. There are many songs from underground as well.
But let me tell you this story. If I can keep my own emotions in check. My mother was one of the 11 children, and earlier this year, the last of her siblings was diagnosed with cancer, and I thought I've got to go and interview him to see what he can still remember. So I jumped in my car with my camera and I went down to meet Uncle Michael. And he told me that my grandfather came out from Yorkshire with the Yorkshire Yeomanry to fight in that war. He was one of 16 children, large Catholic family, very little prospects, except, enlist in the army. So he enlisted, he hardly knew how to ride a horse properly. But he arrives in South Africa, a young man, to fight in that war. Fortunately, he survives it. So does he now go back after the war back to Europe? No, he's going to stay here. And he worked in the gold mine, deep underground, as a mine labourer. He didn't have any other skills. My uncle then spontaneously tells me a story which shows that Zulu people singing is more than just about motivation and all of this. It's life-saving.
His experiences in the mine were shocking. I mean, he was lost twice.
Really? Underground?
Yeah, sure. And one time he lay down eventually, and you could see rats' eyes, and there was an inch of water on the ground, and he was gone. But he heard, you know how Zulus like singing softly when they're walking around to themselves. He heard this noise of singing. He jumped up and ran. Didn't know where to go, but just tried to follow the noise. And came across this Zulu, and this bloke tried to run away. But my old man stopped him, and then this bloke found out he was genuine and led him to the outlet.
Oh my goodness. I tell that story. It is so much more than just a historical story, because there's something deeply symbolic about it. And one of my friends is Professor Musa Manzi, who is a professor in geophysics at Wits. And he's also Zulu. And I was asking him, Musa, why did you go into geology? And he says, well, because I wanted to try and do what I can to prevent rock falls and rock bursts underground, which put so many black, mostly lives at risk. Then I told them a story about how my grandfather was saved by a Zulu man. Oh, I can't wait to tell my students that story. So he's now adopted it as symbolic of his own motivation. So I said, well, yes, you can tell the story to your students, but you've got to sing it. You've got to put it into words. I'm sure you can do something with that narrative. That's not fiction, that's history.
Wow.
I mean, am I abdicating my role to write?
Passing the buck.
So you're not going to tell us what your next book is just yet. You know, I know writers should never tell them that.
No. As I said, it's a sequel to The Longest March.
Okay.
So yeah, Ndugu and Philippa are in Pietermaritzburg. So they are raising their child. What happens then? Or how do they plant their roots in this new and foreign locale, which is Pietermaritzburg? And what happened then during the time? Remember, the war ended in 1902, but they stayed on in Pietermaritzburg. And what happened in Pietermaritzburg 4 years later?
Bambata Rebellion. Yes, of course, you talk a lot, and you also have ancestral connections to Bambata.
Yeah. So basically, that's the next story, but it involves my main characters from the previous book. I'm trying to challenge that the narrative that denies the existence of homosexuality in the black community in the past. To say, let's face the truth, it was there. However, it was not spoken about. Let's speak about it. Let's tell these truths.
Wonderful.
Yes.
And that's for the healing. Brené Brown, who is one of my great inspirations as a social worker from the US, she says that if we own our stories, then we get to finish them. If we don't own our stories, and somebody else will try and finish it. Because that the failure to own the story is a failure to deal with your shame and your own vulnerability.
Yes.
And even though it's painful to have to go into that deep space,
introspection,
it's always better to do that than not to do it. Because if you don't, and if you try and sort of suppress it, it shows itself and projects itself in all sorts of other ways. So I share that with you because I'm so grateful that I don't have to pontificate about that. I can just say to people, read Fred Khumalo's book. Start with your autobiographical story, then read his novels, and you'll start seeing that, yes, that's true.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you very much. An honor and a privilege to be here. Great.
It has,